Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through the extraordinary life of Henry V of England, the warrior king whose legendary victory at Agincourt became one of history's most celebrated triumphs. From his turbulent youth as Prince Hal to his meteoric rise as England's greatest medieval monarch, this complete tale will softly guide you through his remarkable transformation, his conquests in France, and the immortal legacy that inspired Shakespeare himself. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way. And here's something special. I know many of you wonderful listeners are a bit shy about commenting, but your thoughts and stories truly make our Sleepy Crown family special. Whether it's sharing which part of Henry's story resonates with you or simply saying hello from wherever you're listening tonight, every comment creates a warm connection in our cozy community. Don't worry about being perfect. Just share what's in your heart. Your fellow dreamers and I would love to hear from you. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from medieval England lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Henry, later known as King Henry V of England, entered this world on a crisp September morning in 1386 at Monmouth Castle in Wales. The ancient stones of this fortress, perched near the English border, would witness the birth of one who would become England's most celebrated warrior king. His father, Henry of Bolingbroke, was a man of noble bearing and considerable ambition, while his mother, Mary de Bohun, brought with her the refined grace of one of England's most distinguished aristocratic families. The castle where young Henry drew his first breath stood as a symbol of the turbulent times into which he was born. Wales itself was a land of rolling green hills and misty valleys, where ancient Celtic traditions mingled with Norman influences. The boy who would one day lead England to glory at Agincourt began his life surrounded by the rugged beauty of the Welsh borderlands, where the sound of rushing streams and the call of mountain birds created nature's own lullaby. Mary de Bohun, Henry's mother, was a woman of exceptional learning and gentle temperament. She had married Henry of Bolingbroke when she was merely 11 years old, though they did not begin their life together until she reached 15. Their union proved to be one of genuine affection and shared interests, particularly their mutual love of literature, music, and the finer arts. Mary possessed an extensive collection of illuminated manuscripts and was known to spend long hours reading by candlelight in the castle's solar. The marriage blessed the couple with 6 children in 8 years. After Henry came Thomas in 1387, followed by John in 1389, Humphrey in 1390, Blanche in 1392, and finally Philippa in 1394. Tragically, Mary would not live to see her eldest son ascend to the throne, dying in childbirth with her last daughter at Peterborough Castle. She was laid to rest in the peaceful confines of Saint Mary de Castro in Leicester, her gentle spirit remembered by all who knew her. Young Henry's father, Henry of Bolingbroke, was a remarkable figure in his own right. Well educated in the traditions of medieval chivalry, he could read and write in English, French and Latin with equal facility. His love of music and literature rivaled that of his wife, and their castle often echoed with the sounds of minstrels and the quiet discussions of learned men. Bolingbroke had proven himself as a true knight, excelling in tournaments, participating in crusades to Lithuania, and making the arduous pilgrimage to the Holy Land. But beneath this cultured exterior lay the complex political realities of late 14th century England. As the son of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, and grandson of the mighty Edward III, Bolingbroke's very existence posed a potential threat to the reigning monarch, Richard II. The young Henry would grow up acutely aware that his family's royal blood could be both blessing and curse, elevating them to greatness or destroying them utterly. The England into which Henry was born was a realm emerging from the shadows of the devastating Black Death, which had swept across Europe in the previous century. The social fabric of the nation had been fundamentally altered, with traditional feudal structures giving way to new forms of organisation. The Church, too, was experiencing upheaval, with reformers like John Wycliffe challenging established doctrines and practices. In France, the situation was equally tumultuous. King Charles VI suffered from periodic bouts of madness, leaving the kingdom vulnerable to internal strife and external pressure. The great conflict known as the 100 Years' War had been raging intermittently since 1337, as English kings pressed their claims to French territories and even the French throne itself. This was the world into which the future Henry V was born, a world where warfare and diplomacy, chivalry and treachery existed in constant tension. The young prince's earliest years were spent in the relative security of his family's Lancastrian holdings. The castle of Monmouth, with its commanding view of the surrounding countryside, provided both protection and a vantage point from which to observe the wider world. Here, surrounded by devoted servants and teachers, Henry began his education in the arts of war and peace that would serve him so well in later years. Even as a child, Henry displayed the keen intelligence and natural leadership that would characterize his adult life. His tutors noted his quick grasp of languages and his particular aptitude for military strategy. He learned to ride before he could, properly walk, and by the age of 6 he was already showing promise with sword and bow. Yet it was not merely his physical prowess that impressed those around him. It was his ability to inspire loyalty and affection in others, a quality that would prove invaluable in the years to come. The peaceful routine of Henry's early childhood was destined to be shattered by the political upheavals that would define his youth. In 1398, when Henry was 12 years old, his father was banished from England by King Richard II, who had grown increasingly suspicious of the Lancastrian family's power and influence. The young prince found himself suddenly thrust into the dangerous world of medieval politics, taken as a hostage to ensure his father's continued good behaviour. Despite the circumstances of his captivity, Richard II treated the boy with kindness and even affection. The king, who had no children of his own, seemed to find genuine pleasure in the company of the intelligent and spirited young prince. Henry accompanied Richard on his expeditions to Ireland, visiting ancient castles and experiencing firsthand the complexities of ruling a diverse and often rebellious kingdom. During his time in the royal court, Henry gained invaluable insights into the art of kingship. He observed how Richard wielded power, noting both the king's strengths and his fatal weaknesses. The experience would prove formative, teaching him lessons about leadership, diplomacy, and the delicate balance between authority and consent that he would later apply during his own reign. The year 1399 would prove to be a turning point not only for Henry's family, but for the entire Kingdom of England. When John of Gaunt died that spring, Richard II made the fateful decision to confiscate the Lancastrian estates, denying Bolingbroke his rightful inheritance. This act of arbitrary royal power provided the spark that would ignite a revolution, as Bolingbroke returned from exile to claim what was his by right. What began as a quest to reclaim stolen lands quickly escalated into something far more momentous. The political community of England, long dissatisfied with Richard's increasingly erratic rule, rallied to Bolingbroke's banner. Within months, Richard II had been deposed, and Henry's father had been crowned as King Henry IV. The young prince, barely 13 years old, found himself elevated to a position he could never have imagined, heir apparent to the throne of England. On the day of his father's coronation, October 13th, 1399, Henry played a ceremonial role that symbolised his new status. Carrying the sword of justice in the coronation procession, he walked through Westminster Abbey before the assembled nobles and clergy of the realm. Shortly after the ceremony, he was invested with the ancient titles that marked him as heir to the throne: Prince of Wales, Duke of Cornwall, Earl of Chester, Duke of Aquitaine, and Duke of Lancaster. These were not merely honorary titles, but came with real responsibilities and substantial revenues. As Prince of Wales, Henry would be expected to govern the often rebellious Welsh territories, while his other holdings provided the income necessary to maintain a household befitting his rank. Even at his young age, he began to understand the weight of responsibility that would one day rest upon his shoulders. The transformation from royal hostage to heir apparent represented more than just a change in Henry's political status. It marked the beginning of his education in the realities of power. No longer sheltered from the harsh truths of medieval politics, he would soon face challenges that would test his courage, intelligence, and character. The boy who had been born in the peaceful surroundings of Monmouth Castle was about to become a man in the unforgiving crucible of war and rebellion. The dawn of the 15th century found young Prince Henry thrust into a world of conflict and challenge that would shape him into the remarkable leader he would become. As the heir to a usurped throne, his position was far from secure, and the realm his father had claimed was beset by rebellions and threats from every direction. It was in these tumultuous early years of his father's reign that Henry would learn the harsh lessons of leadership and warfare that would serve him so well in later life. The most immediate challenge facing the new Lancastrian dynasty came from the wild and mountainous regions of Wales, where a remarkable figure named Owain Glyndwr had raised the banner of rebellion against English rule. Glyndwr was no ordinary rebel. He was an educated gentleman who had studied law at the Inns of Court in London and had served with distinction in the English army. Yet circumstances had driven him to proclaim himself Prince of Wales and to wage a guerrilla war that would consume the better part of a decade. King Henry IV, still struggling to establish his authority throughout England, made the crucial decision to place his teenage son in charge of suppressing the Welsh rebellion. It was an enormous responsibility for a boy not yet 14 years old, but it reflected both the urgency of the situation and the king's confidence in his heir's abilities. From 1400 onward, Prince Henry would effectively govern Wales in his father's name, learning through bitter experience the realities of military command and political administration. The Welsh countryside, where Henry would spend much of his youth, was a land of stunning beauty and deadly peril. Rolling green hills gave way to treacherous mountain passes where rebels could strike without warning before melting away into the mist-shrouded valleys. Ancient castles dotted the landscape, their stone walls often the only islands of English authority in a sea of Welsh resistance. Here, among the rushing streams and windswept moors, the future Henry V would learn the arts of war from masters who taught their lessons with steel and blood. The prince's mentor in these early campaigns was Sir Henry Percy, known throughout England as Hotspur, for his impetuous bravery and fierce loyalty to the crown. Percy was everything a young knight aspired to be: courageous, honourable, and deadly in battle. Under his tutelage, Henry learned not only the technical aspects of warfare, but also the subtle arts of leadership that could inspire men to follow him into mortal danger. The Welsh War taught Henry lessons that extended far beyond the battlefield. Chief among these was the crucial importance of maintaining adequate supplies and ensuring proper financing for military operations. Time and again, he found himself writing desperate letters to his father, pleading for money to pay his soldiers and supplies to feed his army. These experiences would later inform his meticulous planning for the French campaigns that would make him famous. The conflict with Glyndwr was unlike the formal battles that had characterised earlier English campaigns in France. This was a war of raid and counter-raid, of ambush and pursuit, where victory often went to those who could move fastest and strike hardest. Henry learned to adapt his tactics to the terrain and the enemy, developing the flexibility and quick thinking that would serve him so well at Agincourt. During these campaigns, Henry also began to understand the importance of winning the hearts and minds of the local population. Unlike some of his commanders, who viewed the Welsh as irredeemably hostile, the prince recognised that lasting peace could only be achieved through a combination of firm military action and just governance. He made efforts to protect Welsh civilians from the excesses of his soldiers and to demonstrate that English rule could bring benefits as well as burdens. The year 1403 brought a crisis that would test both Henry's military skills and his personal loyalty in the most dramatic fashion possible. Sir Henry Percy, his beloved mentor, had grown increasingly frustrated with King Henry IV's inability to provide adequate support for the Welsh campaigns. Percy's grievances were compounded by disputes over the treatment of Scottish prisoners and the king's failure to reimburse him for his expenses in defending the northern borders. These frustrations eventually boiled over into open rebellion, as Percy allied himself with Owain Glyndwr and the powerful Douglas family of Scotland. The man who had taught Henry the arts of war was now determined to overthrow his father and place the rival claimant Edmund Mortimer on the throne. For the young prince, this represented not just a political crisis, but a profound personal betrayal that cut to the very core of his understanding of loyalty and honour. The confrontation came to a head on July 21st, 1403, at the Battle of Shrewsbury, one of the bloodiest encounters ever fought on English soil. As the two armies faced each other across the field, Henry found himself in the terrible position of having to fight against the very man who had shaped him as a warrior. The irony was not lost on him. Percy's own teachings would now be turned against their teacher. The battle itself was a savage affair, with both sides fighting with the desperate fury of men who knew that defeat meant death or exile. Henry commanded a division of his father's army with skill beyond his years, demonstrating the tactical acumen and personal courage that would later make him famous. When the clash came, it was with the thunder of steel on steel and the terrible music of men dying for their beliefs. In the midst of the melee, disaster nearly struck the Lancastrian cause. An arrow shot from Percy's lines struck the prince squarely in the face just below his right eye. The bodkin point penetrated 6 inches into his skull, a wound that would have killed any ordinary man instantly. Somehow, Henry remained conscious and continued to fight, his face masked in blood, but his sword arm still strong. The sight of their young commander fighting on despite his terrible wound inspired Henry's men to even greater efforts. The tide of battle gradually turned in their favour, and by evening, Percy lay dead among the heaps of slain, his rebellion crushed and his followers scattered. The victory came at a terrible cost. Hundreds of England's finest knights and men-at-arms lay dead on the field, and the prince himself hovered between life and death. The extraction of the arrowhead from Henry's skull required all the skill of John Bradmore, the royal physician. Working with instruments of his own design, Bradmore carefully withdrew the bodkin point and cleansed the wound with wine and honey. The operation was successful, but it left Henry with permanent scars that would serve as a constant reminder of the price of loyalty and the cost of rebellion. The Battle of Shrewsbury marked a turning point in Henry's development as both a warrior and a leader. The physical courage he had displayed was remarkable enough, but equally impressive was his ability to maintain discipline and morale among his troops under the most trying circumstances. Word of his conduct spread throughout England, establishing his reputation as a prince worthy of the crown he would one day inherit. The victory at Shrewsbury effectively ended the Northern Rebellion, but the war in Wales continued to rage with unabated fury. Henry threw himself into the campaign with renewed determination, applying the lessons he had learned from both victory and near defeat. His tactics became more sophisticated, his planning more thorough, and his understanding of the political dimensions of warfare more nuanced. In March 1405, Henry achieved a significant victory over Glyndwr's forces at Grosmont, capturing one of the Welsh prince's sons and dealing a severe blow to rebel morale. This was followed by another success at Usk in May, the first major English victory in a pitched battle since the rebellion began. The tide was beginning to turn as Henry's methodical approach to warfare gradually constricted the rebels' freedom of movement and cut their lines of supply. The siege of Aberystwyth in 1407 demonstrated Henry's growing mastery of the art of war. Rather than attempting a costly direct assault, he established a blockade that slowly starved the garrison into submission. The castle fell after a year-long siege, its capture marking another step in the gradual reconquest of Wales. Even the French, who had been providing aid to Glyndwr, began to withdraw their support as it became clear that the rebellion was doomed. The final act of the Welsh War came with the siege of Harlech Castle in 1408. This ancient fortress, perched on its rocky promontory overlooking the Irish Sea, had become the last major stronghold of Welsh resistance. Within its walls were not only Glyndwr and the remnants of his family, but also Edmund Mortimer, the rival claimant to the English throne whose very existence threatened the Lancastrian dynasty. The siege of Harlech was a masterpiece of medieval warfare, combining careful planning, superior logistics, and relentless pressure. Henry had learned from his earlier experiences the importance of maintaining adequate supplies and ensuring proper coordination between his various forces. The castle was gradually isolated from all outside support, its garrison slowly weakened by hunger and disease. When Harlech finally fell in 1409, it marked not just the end of the effective Welsh resistance, but also the elimination of a major threat to Lancastrian legitimacy. Edmund Mortimer died during the siege, while his family members were taken to London as prisoners. Glyndwr himself managed to escape into the mountains with one of his sons, but he was never again a significant political force. The Great Welsh Rebellion was over, and Henry had emerged victorious. The successful conclusion of the Welsh War established Prince Henry as one of the most capable military commanders in Europe. More importantly, it had given him invaluable experience in the practical arts of leadership and administration. He had learned how to inspire loyalty in his followers, how to coordinate complex military operations, and how to balance the competing demands of warfare and governance. Yet even as Henry was achieving triumph in Wales, his relationship with his father was becoming increasingly strained. King Henry IV's health had begun to decline after 1405, with mysterious seizures and periods of incapacity that raised questions about his ability to rule effectively. As the king's condition worsened, more and more responsibility fell to his eldest son, who gradually began to assert greater control over the government of England. By 1409, Prince Henry was effectively ruling England in all but name. He had placed his own supporters in key positions, reformed the crown's finances, and begun to pursue an independent foreign policy that sometimes conflicted with his father's wishes. This growing autonomy did not sit well with the king, who still harboured hopes of recovering his health and resuming full control of the realm. The tension between father and son came to a head in 1411, when Henry IV, during one of his periods of partial recovery, suddenly reasserted his authority and dismissed his son's supporters from their positions. The king's action was motivated partly by disagreements over financial policy. Henry had been cutting back on royal annuities to reduce expenses, while his father believed this would only alienate the crown's supporters. The confrontation was deeply painful for both men. Henry felt that his years of faithful service and successful leadership entitled him to a greater voice in government, while his father feared that premature abdication would only invite further challenges to Lancastrian legitimacy. The crisis was eventually resolved when Henry swallowed his pride and formally submitted to his father's authority, but the scars of the conflict would remain. The reconciliation came just in time, for Henry IV's health continued to deteriorate throughout 1412 and early 1413. On March 20th, 1413, the king died in the Jerusalem chamber at Westminster Abbey, his long struggle finally at an end. Prince Henry, now 26 years old and bearing the physical and emotional scars of a lifetime of conflict, prepared to assume the crown that destiny had always intended for him. The death of King Henry IV on that grey March morning in 1413 marked not merely the end of one reign, but the beginning of what would become one of the most transformative periods in English history. As Prince Henry knelt beside his father's deathbed in the Jerusalem chamber at Westminster Abbey, he understood that he was inheriting far more than just a crown. He was taking responsibility for a kingdom still scarred by usurpation, rebellion, and the constant threat of renewed civil war. The coronation of King Henry V took place on April 9th, 1413, amid circumstances that seemed almost mystical in their significance. As the young king processed through Westminster Abbey to receive the ancient crown of England, a sudden spring blizzard began to fall, blanketing London in an unseasonable carpet of white. The courtiers and commons gathered to witness the ceremony debated whether this unexpected snowfall was a good omen or ill, but Henry himself seemed unperturbed by the strange weather, accepting it as yet another test that Providence had placed before him. At 26 years of age, Henry possessed a commanding physical presence that immediately marked him as a natural leader. Contemporary accounts describe him as tall and lean, standing well over 6 feet in height, at a time when most men barely reached 5.5 feet. His dark hair was cropped in the fashion of a knight, and his face bore the unmistakable scars of his wound at Shrewsbury, marks that served as a constant reminder of his courage in battle and his willingness to shed blood for the crown he now wore. But it was Henry's eyes that most impressed those who met him. Depending on his mood, observers noted, they could shift from the gentle warmth of a dove to the fierce intensity of a lion. Here was a man who had been forged in the crucible of war and rebellion, who had learned the arts of leadership through bitter experience, and who now possessed both the wisdom to govern justly and the strength to defend his realm against all enemies. From the very first days of his reign, Henry demonstrated that his kingship would be markedly different from that of his predecessors. Where Richard II had been capricious and tyrannical, and Henry IV had been cautious and defensive, the new king displayed a confidence and sense of purpose that immediately commanded respect. He understood that his family's hold on the throne remained precarious, and that only through decisive action and undeniable success could he transform the Lancastrian dynasty from usurpers into legitimate rulers. One of Henry's first acts as king was to address the various grievances and injustices that had accumulated during his father's troubled reign. He freed Edmund Mortimer and his brother Roger, the rival claimants to the throne who had spent years under guard, not only pardoning them, but restoring them to their lands and titles. This gesture of magnanimity served multiple purposes. It demonstrated the new king's confidence in his own legitimacy, while also removing potential sources of future rebellion. Similarly, Henry reached out to the families of those who had opposed his father, offering reconciliation where possible and demonstrating that the divisions of the past need not define the future. The son of the fallen Percy, Hotspur's heir, was eventually restored to his family's estates, while other former enemies found themselves welcomed back into the royal favour. This policy of reconciliation was not born of weakness, but of a shrewd understanding that a kingdom divided against itself could never achieve the greatness that Henry envisioned. The new king also moved swiftly to address one of the most pressing challenges facing his realm, the question of religious unity. The Lollard movement, inspired by the teachings of John Wycliffe, continued to challenge the authority of the established church and, by extension, the divine basis of royal authority. Henry understood that religious dissent could easily transform into political rebellion, as had been demonstrated during his father's reign. The test of Henry's resolve came in the person of Sir John Oldcastle, a longtime friend and companion who had served with distinction during the Welsh campaigns. Oldcastle had become a prominent Lollard, openly challenging church doctrine and refusing to recant his heretical beliefs, even when brought before the Archbishop of Canterbury. The situation placed Henry in an agonising position. His personal affection for Oldcastle, warred with his duty as a Christian king to uphold orthodox faith, Henry gave his old friend every opportunity to save himself, offering him a 40-day period of reflection in which to reconsider his position. When Oldcastle not only refused to recant but escaped from the Tower of London and began plotting against the king's life, Henry had no choice but to act decisively. The subsequent suppression of the Lollard uprising demonstrated that the new king would not allow personal sentiment to interfere with his royal duties, no matter how painful the consequences might be. The Oldcastle affair also revealed another crucial aspect of Henry's character, his deep and genuine piety. Unlike many medieval monarchs who treated religion as merely a tool of statecraft, Henry appears to have been sincerely devout, viewing his kingship as a sacred trust from God. This religious conviction would inform all his major decisions, from his domestic policies to his eventual decision to renew the war with France. Indeed, it was in the realm of foreign policy that Henry's ambitions were most clearly revealed. From the very beginning of his reign, he had been planning for what he saw as his divinely appointed mission, the recovery of his rightful inheritance in France. The great conflict known as the 100 Years' War had been raging intermittently since 1337, as English kings pressed their claims to French territories and even the French throne itself. These claims were not merely matters of royal pride, but had profound implications for England's security and prosperity. The situation in France in 1413 appeared to offer Henry a unique opportunity to press his ancestral claims. King Charles VI suffered from periodic bouts of madness that left the kingdom leaderless for months at a time. During these periods of royal incapacity, two great factions, the Burgundians and the Armagnacs, fought for control of the government, their rivalry often erupting into open warfare that devastated the countryside and weakened French resistance to external threats. Henry's diplomatic approach to the French question demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of international relations that he had developed during his years as heir apparent. Rather than simply declaring war, he opened negotiations with Charles VI's government, making demands that were carefully calculated to be unacceptable while appearing reasonable to neutral observers. He requested the return of all English territories ceded by previous treaties, the payment of outstanding debts from earlier conflicts, and the hand of the French Princess Catherine in marriage, along with a dowry that would have bankrupted the French treasury. The French response to these demands was predictably negative, but Henry had achieved his primary objective. He had demonstrated to his own subjects and to the rulers of Europe that he was seeking justice rather than conquest, that he was the injured party seeking redress for legitimate grievances. This diplomatic manoeuvring was crucial in securing both domestic support for the enormous expenses that would be required for a major military campaign and international recognition for the justice of his cause. Throughout 1414 and early 1415, Henry threw himself into the preparations for war with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterised his Welsh campaigns. Unlike his predecessors, who had often launched military expeditions on the basis of royal enthusiasm and aristocratic bravado, Henry understood that modern warfare required careful planning, adequate financing, and superior logistics. The king's approach to military finance was particularly innovative. Rather than relying solely on traditional feudal obligations and parliamentary grants, he actively solicited loans from wealthy merchants and nobles, using the crown jewels and other royal treasures as collateral. This approach not only raised the enormous sums required for the campaign, but also created a broad coalition of interests with a stake in English success. When England's merchants and financiers had invested their own money in the war effort, they became powerful advocates for the policies that would ensure victory. Henry also recognised the crucial importance of naval power in any campaign against France. The English Channel might serve as a protective moat for England, but it could also become a barrier that trapped English armies in hostile territory if French naval forces gained control of the sea lanes. Accordingly, the king ordered the construction of new warships, while also negotiating agreements with Flemish and other maritime powers to ensure that England would enjoy naval superiority throughout the coming campaign. The military forces that Henry assembled for his French adventure represented the culmination of over a century of English military evolution. The core of his army consisted of men-at-arms, heavily armoured knights, and professional soldiers who formed the backbone of medieval armies. But the truly revolutionary element was the large contingent of longbowmen, mainly recruited from England and Wales, who had proven their devastating effectiveness in earlier conflicts. The English longbow was far more than just a weapon. It was a technological and social revolution that had transformed the nature of medieval warfare. Unlike the crossbow, which could be mastered relatively quickly by any reasonably strong man, the longbow required years of practice to use effectively. This had led to the development of a unique military culture in England and Wales, where archery was not merely a martial skill, but a way of life that permeated entire communities. The men who answered Henry's call to arms in 1415 were not aristocratic knights seeking glory and honour, but ordinary craftsmen, farmers, and labourers who saw military service as an opportunity for adventure and profit. They were bakers and blacksmiths, carpenters and candlestick makers, united by their skill with the longbow and their loyalty to the king, who promised to lead them to victory and wealth in France. As spring turned to summer in 1415, the great military machine that Henry had been constructing for months began to move toward its ultimate test. Ships gathered in Portsmouth and other southern ports, their holds crammed with weapons, supplies, and the thousands of men who would carry English arms to French soil. The king himself made his final preparations, completing his will and making arrangements for the government of England during his absence. On August 11th, 1415, with favourable winds filling the sails of his fleet, King Henry V set sail for France, carrying with him the hopes and fears of a nation. Few could have predicted that this expedition would culminate in one of the most famous battles in military history, a victory so complete and unexpected that it would echo through the centuries and inspire poets and playwrights to celebrate the triumph of English arms at Agincourt. The king who departed England that summer day was no longer the untested youth who had received his crown just 2 years earlier. The responsibilities of kingship had completed the transformation that had begun in the hills of Wales, forging him into a leader capable of inspiring ordinary men to achieve extraordinary things. As his fleet disappeared over the horizon, England held its breath and waited to see whether their warrior king would return in triumph, or whether he would join the long list of monarchs who had sought glory in France only to find defeat and death. The grey waters of the English Channel had barely closed behind King Henry's invasion fleet when the first reports began to reach the French court that England's warrior king had finally made good on his threats. On the morning of August 14th, 1415, as the summer sun climbed over the Norman coastline, Henry's army began disembarking near the mouth of the River Seine, their armour glinting in the early light as they prepared to claim what their king believed to be his rightful inheritance. The target of Henry's first assault was the fortified port town of Harfleur, a strategic prize that had long served as a base for French raids against English shipping. The town's position near the mouth of the Seine made it invaluable for controlling access to the river and, by extension, to the heart of northern France. But Harfleur was no easy conquest. Its walls were thick and well maintained, its towers bristled with defensive engines, and its garrison was commanded by experienced soldiers who had no intention of yielding without a fierce struggle. As Henry's forces established their siege lines around the town, the king issued a formal demand for surrender according to the ancient laws of war. Drawing upon biblical precedent, he warned the defenders that their refusal to yield peacefully would justify whatever harsh measures might follow. This was not mere bluster, but a calculated attempt to undermine the morale of the garrison while demonstrating to his own troops that their cause was just and their actions sanctioned by divine law. The defenders of Harfleur, led by the experienced soldier Raoul de Gaucourt, rejected Henry's demands with the contempt they felt they deserved. They had faith in their strong walls, their brave men, and their expectation that relief would come from the scattered French forces that were slowly assembling in the countryside beyond the English siege lines. What they had not anticipated was the methodical efficiency with which Henry would conduct his assault. The siege of Harfleur became a masterclass in the application of medieval military technology and tactics. Henry's engineers deployed massive siege engines alongside the newer gunpowder weapons that were beginning to revolutionize warfare. Day and night the bombardment continued, with stone balls and iron shot crashing into the town's defences, while the constant thunder of the guns echoed across the Norman countryside. Yet the defenders proved remarkably resourceful in their resistance. French carpenters worked frantically to repair breaches in the walls, while sorties from the garrison harassed the English siege works and inflicted significant casualties on Henry's irreplaceable specialists. Countermining operations attempted to collapse the tunnels that English engineers were digging beneath the walls, leading to vicious underground battles fought by lamplight in narrow earthen passages. As September arrived and the siege entered its second month, Henry faced a crisis that threatened to derail his entire campaign. The unsanitary conditions of the siege camp, combined with the summer heat and contaminated water supplies, had triggered an outbreak of dysentery that was devastating his army. Men who had survived the crossing from England were now dying in their hundreds from disease, while many more were too weak to fight effectively. The roster of casualties read like a roll call of English nobility. Earls and knights fell victim to the plague alongside common soldiers, their high birth offering no protection against the invisible enemy that stalked through the camp. Even members of the royal family were not immune. Henry's brother Thomas, the Duke of Clarence, was among those who fell seriously ill and had to be shipped back to England for recovery. For a lesser commander, the combination of stubborn enemy resistance and rampant disease might have been enough to force an abandonment of the siege. But Henry had not spent years learning the arts of war in Wales only to be defeated by his first major challenge in France. Instead, he adapted his tactics, intensifying the bombardment while preparing for a final assault that would take the town by storm if necessary. The breakthrough came in late September, when English forces finally managed to capture the Barbican, the fortified gateway that protected Harfleur's main entrance. Led by John Holland, Earl of Huntingdon, the assault troops fought their way through, a storm of arrows and crossbow bolts to plant the English banner on the outer defences. With their last line of protection breached, the defenders knew that further resistance would only lead to the massacre that would follow if the town were taken by storm. On September 22nd, 1415, after more than 5 weeks of siege, Harfleur finally opened its gates in surrender. The terms negotiated between Henry and the garrison were typical of medieval warfare. The defenders were allowed to march out with their weapons and personal belongings, while the town itself became English property. Raoul de Gaucourt and his men were granted safe passage to Calais, where they would present themselves as prisoners, their honour intact despite their defeat. Henry's first reaction upon entering the conquered town was to proceed directly to the church of St. Michael, where he knelt in prayer and gave thanks for his victory. This act of piety was characteristic of the deeply religious king, who genuinely believed that his successes came not from his own abilities, but from divine favour. He then addressed his troops, reiterating the strict code of conduct that would govern English behaviour in occupied French territory. The rules Henry established for his army reflected both his moral convictions and his strategic understanding of the importance of winning French hearts and minds. Churches and religious buildings were to be protected at all costs. Clergy and women were not to be harmed unless they actively resisted, and rape was punishable by death. These orders were not merely for show. Henry enforced them rigorously, understanding that his claim to be the rightful king of France would be undermined if his soldiers behaved like common brigands. The capture of Harfleur represented a significant strategic victory, but it had come at a terrible cost. Of the roughly 12,000 men who had sailed from England 6 weeks earlier, perhaps only 9,000 remained fit for duty. Disease had claimed more casualties than French weapons, while the need to garrison the newly conquered town would further reduce the forces available for the march to Calais that Henry was now planning. The decision to march overland to Calais rather than return to England by sea was one that would define Henry's reign and establish his place in the pantheon of English military heroes. His advisers argued strongly against the venture, pointing out that the army was weakened by disease and that French forces were gathering throughout Normandy. A sea voyage to England would be safe and would allow the king to return in triumph, having achieved his stated objective of capturing Harfleur. But Henry's vision extended far beyond the conquest of a single town. He understood that his ultimate goal, the recovery of his claimed inheritance in France, could only be achieved by demonstrating English power throughout the French heartland. A march across northern France would serve notice that the English king could go where he pleased in what he considered his own domains, while a retreat by sea would suggest that he feared to face French armies in open battle. The decision reflected not recklessness, but careful calculation of the political and military realities facing the Lancastrian dynasty. Henry knew that his hold on the English throne remained tenuous, and that only through dramatic success could he transform his family from usurpers into legitimate rulers. The march to Calais offered the possibility of such success, while retreat would represent a missed opportunity that might not come again for years. On October 8th, 1415, the English army marched out of Harfleur and into the Norman countryside, beginning a journey that would test every lesson Henry had learned during his years of warfare in Wales. The force that departed the captured town was lean and battle-hardened, consisting of approximately 900 men-at-arms and 5,000 archers, along with the essential support personnel who kept medieval armies functioning. The original plan called for a swift march to the crossing point at Blanchetaque, where Edward III had famously forded the Somme during his Crécy campaign 70 years earlier. If all went according to plan, the army would cross the river without opposition and complete the final stage of the journey to Calais in safety. What Henry had not anticipated was the efficiency with which the French would respond to this threat to their homeland. Charles d'Albret, the Constable of France, had learned from the disasters that had befallen French armies in earlier conflicts with English longbowmen. Rather than rushing into premature battle, he adopted a strategy of containment, using the natural barriers provided by rivers and forests to channel the English advance while slowly gathering the forces that would eventually bring the invaders to bay. The first sign that the march would not proceed according to plan came when English scouts reached the Somme estuary and found their path blocked by a substantial French force. The crossing point that Henry had counted on was heavily defended, while the local bridges had been destroyed or were under enemy control. The English army found itself trapped on the wrong side of the river, with French forces gathering in their rear and no clear path forward. For 9 frustrating days, Henry led his increasingly hungry army along the south bank of the Somme, seeking a crossing point while French forces shadowed them on the opposite shore. The delay was costly in more ways than one. Not only did it give the French more time to assemble their forces, but it also stretched English supply lines to the breaking point. Foraging parties sent out to find food often returned empty-handed, while the approach of winter made camping in the open an increasingly miserable experience. The breakthrough came when local villagers, perhaps swayed by English gold or intimidated by English threats, revealed the location of an unguarded ford near the village of Agincourt. On October 19th, the English army finally crossed the Somme, their relief at escaping the trap almost palpable as they resumed their northward march toward Calais and safety. But their troubles were far from over. As the army approached the village of Frévent on October 24th, English scouts came galloping back with alarming news. A massive French army had positioned itself across the road ahead, blocking any further advance toward Calais. The trap that Charles d'Albret had been preparing for weeks was finally ready to spring. Henry called a halt and rode forward to observe the French position with his own eyes. What he saw must have given even this supremely confident king pause for thought. Spread across the valley ahead was an army that dwarfed his own force, its banners and pennons creating a forest of colour that stretched from one side of the horizon to the other. Here were the greatest nobles of France, each eager to win glory by crushing the English invaders who had dared to challenge French power on French soil. As the two armies established their camps within sight of each other, the contrast between them could hardly have been more pronounced. The French camp buzzed with activity and confidence, its many fires twinkling in the darkness, while the sounds of music and laughter carried across the intervening ground. These men had every reason for optimism. They outnumbered their enemies significantly. They were fighting on their own soil, and they had the support of the local population. The English camp, by contrast, was a study in grim determination. Henry had ordered absolute silence among his troops, partly to maintain discipline, but also because he feared that French raids during the night might catch his men off guard. As the king moved through his camp, offering quiet words of encouragement to his soldiers, he must have reflected on the strange turns of fate that had brought him to this place. The young man who had once been a hostage in Richard II's court was now a king facing the greatest challenge of his life. Tomorrow would bring a battle that could end either in glorious victory or devastating defeat, with no middle ground between triumph and catastrophe. As Henry completed his rounds and returned to his own tent, he knew that the next dawn would test every quality of leadership and courage that he had developed during his remarkable journey from prince to king. The stage was now set for one of the most famous battles in military history, a confrontation that would be remembered and celebrated for centuries to come. On the field near the village of Agincourt, the warrior king of England would either vindicate his claims and establish his dynasty forever, or he would join the long roll of monarchs who had sought glory in France only to find death and defeat. The morning of October 25th, 1415, dawned grey and misty over the muddy fields of northern France, the feast day of Saints Crispin and Crispinian, serving as an appropriately solemn backdrop for what would become one of the most celebrated battles in the annals of warfare. As the pale sun struggled through the autumn clouds, two armies faced each other across a narrow valley, their destinies about to be decided by courage, skill, and the inexorable logic of medieval combat. King Henry V rose before dawn on that fateful St. Crispin's Day, as was his custom before any important undertaking. In the quiet of his tent, surrounded by the flickering light of candles and the muffled sounds of an army preparing for battle, he began the day with prayer and contemplation. This deeply religious king understood that the coming hours would test not only his military abilities but also his faith in the divine providence that he believed had guided his steps from the moment of his birth. The battlefield that would forever bear the name of Agincourt was a narrow strip of recently ploughed farmland, hemmed in on both sides by thick woods that prevented any possibility of flanking manoeuvres. Recent rains had turned the heavy clay soil into a glutinous mess that would prove treacherous for heavily armoured men and their war horses. For Henry, surveying the ground in the early morning light, these conditions represented both challenge and opportunity. The English army that deployed for battle that morning was a lean, professional force hardened by weeks of campaigning and bound together by shared hardship and mutual trust. At its core were approximately 900 men-at-arms, the heavily armoured knights and professional soldiers who formed the backbone of medieval armies. These men represented the military elite of England, warriors who had trained since childhood in the arts of war, and who now faced the supreme test of their abilities. But it was the roughly 5,000 longbowmen who truly made Henry's army unique and formidable. These men, drawn primarily from the yeomanry of England and Wales, carried weapons that represented the culmination of centuries of military evolution. The English longbow was not merely a hunting tool adapted for war, but a sophisticated instrument of destruction that required years of practice to master and decades of tradition to perfect. Henry's deployment reflected both his understanding of his army's strengths and his appreciation of the tactical realities imposed by the terrain. He arranged his forces in 3 divisions of men-at-arms, with smaller groups of archers interspersed between them and large contingents of bowmen protecting both flanks. This formation maximised the firepower that could be brought to bear on any attacking force, while ensuring that his precious archers would be protected by the steel wall of his armoured warriors. The preparations for battle included one innovation that would prove crucial to the day's outcome. At Henry's command, his archers cut thousands of sharpened stakes from the surrounding woods, each one as thick as a man's arm and tapering to a deadly point. These stakes would be driven into the ground at an angle, creating a hedge of spear points that would funnel attacking cavalry into killing zones, where the longbows could work their deadly magic. Across the field, the French army presented a magnificent but ultimately flawed spectacle. Here were assembled the greatest names in French chivalry, men whose ancestry could be traced back to Charlemagne, and whose personal honour demanded that they seek glory in the front ranks of battle. The Constable Charles d'Albret commanded nominally, but the reality was that every great lord expected to lead his own contingent and to claim his share of the victory that seemed inevitable. The French deployment reflected the chivalric values that still dominated their military thinking. 3 great divisions of men-at-arms were arranged one behind the other, with the expectation that each would charge in turn until the English line finally broke under the accumulated pressure. Cavalry forces on the flanks were tasked with breaking up the English archer formations, while crossbowmen and other missile troops were relegated to supporting roles that reflected their lower social status. What the French had failed to adequately consider was how the terrain would affect their grand tactical design. The narrow field that had seemed like an advantage, it would concentrate their superior numbers against a smaller enemy force, would actually work against them by preventing effective coordination between their various units. The muddy ground that they had accepted as an inconvenience would prove to be a death trap for heavily armoured men and horses. As the 2 armies faced each other in the early morning mist, neither side seemed eager to begin the fighting. Medieval battles were often preceded by lengthy periods of posturing and negotiation, as commanders sought to gain psychological advantages or to find ways to achieve their objectives without the enormous risks that came with actual combat. For several hours, the armies remained in their positions, each waiting for the other to make the first move. The delay worked to Henry's disadvantage in some ways. His men were already tired and hungry from their long march, and every hour of waiting increased their anxiety about the coming fight. But the king understood that patience was often a virtue in warfare, and he was content to let the French make the first mistakes. His army was deployed defensively, in a position of his choosing, and any attack would have to come across ground that favoured the defenders. Finally, as the morning wore on, and it became clear that the French were content to wait indefinitely, Henry made the decision that would set the day's events in motion. With a simple command, "Banners advance," he ordered his entire army to move forward, carrying their sharpened stakes with them as they advanced to within longbow range of the enemy formations. The movement caught the French by surprise and forced them to react rather than dictate the battle's tempo. As the English line halted and the archers began driving their stakes into the muddy ground, the French commanders realised that they could no longer afford to wait. The English were now close enough for their deadly longbows to begin inflicting casualties, and something had to be done quickly to disrupt their preparations. The first French response was exactly what Henry had hoped for and expected. Cavalry forces on both flanks of the French army spurred forward, their riders confident that they could scatter the lightly armoured archers before the main battle lines engaged. These were not wild charges but disciplined attacks by some of the finest heavy cavalry in Europe, men who had trained since childhood for precisely this type of combat. But as the French horsemen approached the English line, they encountered obstacles that their commanders had not adequately considered. The stakes that the archers had planted created a bristling hedge of spear points that channeled the attack into narrow corridors where defensive fire could be concentrated. The muddy ground slowed the charge and robbed it of the momentum that was essential for success against disciplined infantry. Most critically, the French cavalry found themselves exposed to a devastating storm of arrows fired by men who had been practicing their deadly craft since childhood. The English longbow at close range was capable of punching through all but the finest armour, while the sheer volume of missiles, perhaps 30,000 arrows in the first minute of the charge, created a beaten zone through which no living thing could pass unscathed. The cavalry attack that was supposed to clear the way for the main French assault instead became a disaster that complicated everything that followed. Wounded horses, maddened by pain and terror, galloped back through their own lines, spreading confusion and panic among the men-at-arms who were preparing for their own advance. The sight of their cavalry defeated before it could even reach the enemy line must have been profoundly demoralising for French morale. Yet the French nobility was not easily discouraged, and their chivalric code demanded that they press forward regardless of the obstacles in their path. The first division of men-at-arms, perhaps 4,000 strong, began its advance across the muddy field, their armour glinting dully in the pale autumn light as they struggled through ground that seemed determined to drag them down with every step. The advance of the French men-at-arms represented one of the most magnificent and tragic spectacles in military history. These were the flower of French chivalry, men whose names were known throughout Europe for their prowess in tournament and battle. They advanced in perfect formation, their banners flying proudly above their heads, confident that their superior numbers and fighting skill would carry the day despite the difficulties they had already encountered. But the same factors that had doomed the cavalry charge now worked against the infantry assault with even more devastating effect. The narrow frontage imposed by the terrain meant that only a fraction of the French force could engage at any one time, while those in the rear could do nothing but wait their turn and watch their comrades struggle through the increasingly treacherous mud. The English response to the French advance demonstrated the tactical sophistication that Henry had developed during his years of warfare in Wales. Rather than simply standing passively behind their stakes, the archers maintained a devastating rate of fire that disrupted French formations and inflicted heavy casualties long before the two forces came to grips. When the arrows began to run low, the bowmen dropped their longbows and joined the melee with swords, axes and warhammers. The fighting that followed was brutal even by medieval standards, as exhausted French knights struggled to maintain their footing in mud that was now slick with blood. The English men-at-arms, fighting from a stable defensive position, were able to use their longer weapons to devastating effect, striking at the legs and groins of their enemies while remaining relatively protected themselves. Meanwhile, the nimble archers darted in and out of the melee, using their superior mobility to attack isolated French knights who had become separated from their comrades. The 2nd French Division, seeing their countrymen locked in combat with the English, made the fatal decision to join the attack rather than wait for the outcome of the first assault. This decision, which seemed reasonable at the time, actually made the French situation much worse by adding to the confusion and crowding that was already hampering their efforts. Now, nearly 8,000 French warriors were crammed into a space that could barely accommodate half that number. The psychological effect of this overcrowding was almost as damaging as its tactical consequences. French knights found themselves unable to raise their weapons effectively, pressed so tightly together that they could barely move. Some men fell and were unable to rise again, trampled by their own comrades or suffocated under the weight of bodies piling on top of them. The magnificent French army was in danger of defeating itself without any further intervention from English weapons. Henry himself fought in the thick of the melee, his distinctive royal surcoat making him a target for every French knight who sought to win eternal glory by striking down the English king. At one point, his younger brother Humphrey fell wounded beside him, and Henry stood over the fallen duke's body, fighting off multiple attackers until help could arrive to drag Humphrey to safety. This act of personal courage in defence of family honour epitomised the warrior ideal that Henry embodied. The turning point of the battle came when the archers, having exhausted their arrows and joined the hand-to-hand fighting, began to tip the balance decisively in England's favour. These men, lightly armoured but highly mobile, could move freely through the mud that trapped their heavily armoured opponents. Using warhammers, falchions and even simple daggers, they began the grim work of finishing off French knights who had fallen or become immobilised. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that the French attack had not merely failed, but had turned into a catastrophic defeat. The 3rd Division of the French army, which had been held in reserve, showed no inclination to join what was obviously a lost cause. Individual French knights continued to fight with desperate courage, but organised resistance was collapsing as the reality of their situation became undeniable. The final act of the battle was marked by an incident that would forever taint Henry's otherwise glorious victory. Reports reached the king that French forces had attacked his baggage train in the rear, leading him to fear that he might be caught between two enemy forces. Whether from legitimate tactical concerns or from a desire to prevent his prisoners from rejoining the fight, Henry made the controversial decision to order the execution of most of the French captives who had already surrendered. This command violated the established laws of war and the chivalric code that theoretically governed medieval combat. Many of Henry's own knights refused to carry out the order, finding it beneath their honour to kill helpless prisoners. The task fell largely to the archers, who had fewer scruples about such matters, and who carried out the executions with the same efficiency they had shown throughout the battle. When the fighting finally ended and the field fell silent except for the groans of the wounded and dying, the magnitude of the English victory became clear. French casualties numbered in the thousands, with some estimates suggesting that as many as 6,000 men had fallen, including many of the greatest names in French nobility. The Constable Charles d'Albret lay dead among the heaps of slain, along with the Dukes of Alençon and Bar and countless other nobles, whose deaths would be mourned throughout France. English losses, by contrast, were almost miraculously light. Perhaps 400 men had fallen, including the Duke of York and the Earl of Suffolk, but the great majority of Henry's army had survived the day unscathed. The disparity in casualties was so extreme that it seemed to confirm divine favour for the English cause, lending credence to Henry's claims about the justice of his war and the legitimacy of his rule. As evening fell over the blood-soaked field of Agincourt, King Henry V could reflect on a victory that exceeded his wildest dreams. In a single day, he had destroyed the military power of France, eliminated a generation of his enemies, and established his reputation as one of the greatest military commanders in European history. The young king, who had sailed from England, just 3 months earlier as an untested ruler, had returned as a conqueror, whose name would echo through the centuries. The victory at Agincourt represented more than just a military triumph. It was a vindication of Henry's entire approach to kingship and warfare. His careful preparations, innovative tactics, and personal leadership had combined to produce a result that transformed him from a questionable usurper into a legitimate monarch whose divine favour seemed beyond dispute. The Lancastrian dynasty, which had begun with his father's controversial seizure of the throne, was now established on foundations that appeared unshakable. The news of Henry's triumph at Agincourt spread across Europe with the speed of wildfire, carried by merchants, pilgrims, and diplomatic messengers who could barely contain their amazement at the scale of the English victory. In an age when communication travelled no faster than the swiftest horse, the reports of the battle took on an almost mythical quality as they passed from mouth to mouth, growing in the telling until Henry himself became a figure of legend rather than mere mortal kingship. The immediate aftermath of the battle saw Henry demonstrate the same careful judgment that had characterised his preparations for the campaign. Rather than pursuing the scattered remnants of the French army, or attempting to capitalise immediately on his victory, he methodically secured the battlefield and attended to the wounded. This restraint reflected not timidity but wisdom. His army, though victorious, was still small and far from home, while the political situation in France remained complex and dangerous. The march from Agincourt to Calais, which had seemed so perilous just days before, now became a triumphant procession through countryside where French resistance had evaporated like morning mist. Towns that might have resisted the passage of an English army now opened their gates without demur, their inhabitants awed by reports of the miraculous victory that had destroyed the flower of French chivalry in a single afternoon. When Henry finally reached Calais on October 29th, he found the English garrison and the local population prepared to welcome him as a conquering hero. The king, who had departed England 3 months earlier, with great hopes but uncertain prospects, now stood revealed as a military genius whose achievements rivaled those of the greatest commanders in history. Yet even as the celebrations began, Henry was already planning his next moves in the great game of medieval politics. The sea crossing back to England provided Henry with time for reflection on what he had accomplished and what remained to be done. The victory at Agincourt, spectacular though it was, represented only the first step in his larger ambition to reclaim his inheritance in France. A single battle, no matter how decisive, could not undo centuries of French resistance to English claims, nor could it resolve the fundamental problems that had plagued English rule in France since the time of Henry's great-grandfather Edward III. The king's triumphant return to England on November 16, 1415, occasioned celebrations that dwarfed anything seen in living memory. When Henry landed at Dover, he was greeted by crowds that had gathered from across southeastern England to catch a glimpse of their victorious monarch. The journey from the coast to London became a series of impromptu festivals, as every town and village sought to demonstrate their loyalty to the king, who had vindicated English honour on foreign soil. London's reception of their returning king surpassed even these spontaneous celebrations in its magnificence and careful orchestration. The city fathers had spent weeks planning pageants and displays that would properly honour Henry's achievement while demonstrating the capital's wealth and sophistication. On November 23rd, as the king's procession wound through streets packed with cheering citizens, it seemed as though all of England had come together to celebrate this moment of national triumph. The celebrations were not merely expressions of popular enthusiasm, but carefully calculated political theatre, designed to reinforce Henry's legitimacy and strengthen his position as king. The Lancastrian dynasty, still relatively new and marked by the circumstances of its origin, needed precisely this kind of dramatic success to establish its credentials beyond all question. Agincourt had provided that success in the most spectacular fashion possible. Contemporary accounts of Henry's reception in London speak of elaborate displays that transformed the city into a stage set for royal triumph. Choirs sang hymns of thanksgiving as the king's procession passed beneath arches decorated with heraldic symbols and pious inscriptions. Representatives of the church, the nobility, and the merchant guilds all played their assigned roles in welcoming home the hero of Agincourt, their participation serving to legitimize and sanctify his achievement. Yet even as England celebrated, Henry was keenly aware that his victory, however complete, was only the beginning of a much longer and more complex struggle. The France he sought to rule was not merely a military problem but a political, administrative, and cultural challenge that would require all his skills as a statesman as well as a warrior. The destruction of one French army, however significant, could not by itself deliver the crown of France into English hands. The diplomatic implications of Agincourt were as important as its military consequences. Throughout Europe, rulers and their advisers struggled to comprehend how such a small English force had destroyed what many considered the finest army in Christendom. The reputation for invincibility that French arms had enjoyed since the time of Charlemagne lay shattered in the mud of a Norman field. While English military prowess was suddenly elevated to legendary status, this transformation in England's international standing opened diplomatic opportunities that had been unthinkable before Agincourt. Rulers who had previously viewed Henry as an upstart usurper now sought his friendship and alliance, recognizing that the victor of Agincourt commanded military resources that could tip the balance in any European conflict. The Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund was among the first to recognize these new realities, travelling to England in 1416 to negotiate a treaty of friendship and mutual support. The emperor's visit to England represented a diplomatic triumph that complemented Henry's military victory at Agincourt. Sigismund was one of the most powerful rulers in Europe, and his public recognition of Henry's legitimacy carried enormous weight throughout Christendom. The Treaty of Canterbury, signed during the emperor's stay, not only established formal diplomatic relations between England and the Holy Roman Empire, but also provided implicit support for Henry's claims to the French throne. These diplomatic successes were crucial in preparing the ground for Henry's next military campaign in France. Medieval warfare was as much about international alliances and political legitimacy as it was about battles and sieges, and Henry understood that his ultimate success would depend on his ability to isolate France diplomatically while building a coalition of support for his own claims. The emperor's visit was an important step in this larger strategy. Throughout 1416, Henry continued the careful preparation that had characterized his approach to the Agincourt campaign. Unlike many medieval monarchs who relied on royal enthusiasm and noble obligation to fund their military adventures, Henry understood that sustained warfare required systematic financial planning and broad-based popular support. He worked tirelessly to secure the loans and subsidies that would be necessary for a longer and more ambitious campaign in France. The king's approach to military finance demonstrated the same innovative thinking that had contributed to his victory at Agincourt. Rather than relying solely on traditional sources of revenue, he actively cultivated relationships with merchants, bankers, and other wealthy individuals who could provide the substantial sums required for modern warfare. This approach not only raised the necessary funds, but also created a broad coalition of interests with a stake in English success in France. Henry also recognised that his previous campaign, successful though it had been, had revealed certain weaknesses in English military organisation that needed to be addressed before any future expedition. The outbreak of disease at Harfleur had demonstrated the crucial importance of maintaining proper sanitation and medical care for large armies operating in hostile territory. The king ordered improvements in military medicine and logistics that would serve his forces well in the campaigns to come. The naval dimension of English strategy also received increased attention following the lessons of the Agincourt campaign. Control of the English Channel had proven essential to maintaining communication and supply lines between England and the continental forces, while French naval power posed a constant threat to English operations. Henry ordered the construction of new warships and the improvement of existing vessels, creating a royal navy that could project English power across the seas. Meanwhile, the political situation in France continued to evolve in ways that favoured English ambitions. The catastrophic defeat at Agincourt had not only destroyed a generation of French military leadership, but had also intensified the factional conflicts that had plagued the kingdom since the onset of King Charles VI's madness. The Burgundian and Armagnac factions blamed each other for the disaster, their mutual recriminations making effective resistance to future English attacks increasingly unlikely. Henry's agents in France worked skillfully to exploit these divisions, offering support to whichever faction seemed most likely to advance English interests, while avoiding commitments that might limit future options. This policy of calculated opportunism reflected the king's understanding that political manipulation could often achieve what military force alone could not, particularly in a kingdom as divided and demoralised as France had become following Agincourt. By the summer of 1417, Henry felt sufficiently confident in his preparations to launch the second phase of his conquest of France. This new campaign would be markedly different from the expedition that had culminated at Agincourt. Rather than a swift march designed to demonstrate English power, it would be a systematic conquest aimed at establishing permanent English control over substantial French territories. The target of this new expedition was Normandy, the ancient duchy from which Henry's ancestors had first conquered England in 1066. The symbolic importance of this choice was not lost on contemporary observers. By reconquering Normandy, Henry would be reversing the losses suffered by King John 2 centuries earlier, and restoring the territorial link between England and the continent that had been severed by French conquest. On August 1st, 1417, Henry landed at Touquet with a force that was both larger and better equipped than the army that had fought at Agincourt. The intervening 2 years had allowed him to recruit fresh troops, improve his logistics, and develop the siege equipment that would be necessary for reducing the fortified towns of Normandy. This was no longer an expedition designed to win a single spectacular victory, but a methodical campaign of conquest that might take years to complete. The siege of Caen, which began shortly after Henry's landing, demonstrated both the strengths and the challenges of this new approach to warfare. The town was strongly fortified and well garrisoned, its defenders confident that they could resist any English assault. Yet Henry's systematic approach to siege warfare, combining traditional methods with the latest innovations in gunpowder technology, gradually wore down their resistance. When Caen finally fell on September 4th, 1417, after a siege of nearly 5 weeks, it marked not merely another English victory but the beginning of a new phase in the conquest of France. Unlike the rapid march that had preceded Agincourt, this campaign would be measured in months and years rather than weeks, its ultimate success dependent on Henry's ability to maintain both military pressure and political coherence over an extended period. The king who had won immortal fame on the field of Agincourt was now embarking on an even greater challenge. The transformation of military victory into lasting political control. The battles and sieges that lay ahead would test different qualities of leadership than those that had served him so well in his moment of greatest triumph, requiring patience, diplomacy, and administrative skill alongside the martial prowess that had already made his name legendary throughout Europe. The systematic conquest of Normandy that followed Henry's landing in 1417 revealed new dimensions of the king's abilities as both military commander and political leader. Unlike the swift campaign that had culminated at Agincourt, this methodical advance through the Norman countryside required patience, diplomatic skill, and the ability to transform military conquest into lasting administrative control. Each captured town presented not merely a tactical challenge, but a complex problem of governance that would test Henry's vision of himself as the rightful ruler of France. The siege of Rouen, which began in the summer of 1418, represented the culmination of Henry's Norman campaign and one of the most controversial episodes of his entire career. This ancient city, the capital of Normandy and one of the greatest commercial centres in northern France, was too important to be bypassed, but too strong to be taken by storm. Its massive walls and experienced garrison promised a siege that would test every aspect of medieval warfare while determining the ultimate fate of English ambitions in France. Henry's approach to the siege demonstrated the tactical sophistication he had developed through years of experience in siege warfare. Rather than attempting a costly direct assault, he established a complete blockade that would slowly starve the city into submission. This strategy required enormous patience and resources, as well as the ability to maintain army discipline and morale during months of tedious and dangerous investment operations. The sufferings of Rouen's civilian population during the siege became one of the darkest chapters in Henry's otherwise glorious military career. As winter approached and food supplies dwindled, the city's leaders made the desperate decision to expel the women, children, and elderly inhabitants who could no longer be fed. These unfortunate souls found themselves trapped in no man's land between the city walls and the English siege lines, where they faced slow death from starvation and exposure. Henry's refusal to allow these civilians to pass through his lines has been debated by historians for centuries. Some argue that he was following the established laws of war, which placed responsibility for civilian welfare on the defending garrison rather than the besieging army. Others contend that his actions violated the moral principles he claimed to uphold and revealed a callous disregard for innocent suffering that contradicted his image as a Christian king. The truth may lie somewhere between these extremes. Henry was fighting a war for the highest possible stakes, the crown of France itself, and he understood that any sign of weakness or sentimentality might encourage further resistance throughout the kingdom. The harsh treatment of Rouen civilians served as a warning to other French cities about the consequences of prolonged resistance, while also demonstrating Henry's determination to achieve his objectives regardless of the cost. When Rouen finally surrendered on January 19th, 1419, after more than 5 months of siege, Henry's victory was complete but Pyrrhic. The city that opened its gates to him was a shadow of its former self, its population decimated by starvation and disease, its economic life disrupted by months of warfare. Yet the strategic importance of its capture could not be denied. With Rouen in English hands, Norman resistance was effectively broken, and the path to Paris lay open. The aftermath of Rouen's fall demonstrated both Henry's vision as a ruler and his understanding of the complexities involved in governing conquered territories. Rather than treating the Norman capital as simply a military prize to be exploited, he set about restoring its economic and administrative functions, while carefully balancing the need to reward his English followers with the importance of reconciling the local French population to English rule. This balance between conquest and conciliation became the hallmark of Henry's approach to governing his French territories. Unlike earlier English occupations, which had often been characterized by harsh exploitation and cultural insensitivity, Henry sought to present himself as a legitimate French king rather than a foreign conqueror. He retained local administrative structures where possible, respected French legal traditions, and made genuine efforts to win the loyalty of his new subjects through just governance. The political situation in France continued to evolve in ways that favoured Henry's ambitions throughout 1419. The rivalry between the Burgundian and Armagnac factions had intensified following the disaster at Agincourt, with each side blaming the other for the catastrophic defeat that had decimated French nobility. This internal division weakened French resistance to English advances while creating opportunities for diplomatic manipulation that Henry exploited with considerable skill. The dramatic events of September 1419 transformed the entire strategic landscape of the conflict. At a carefully arranged meeting on the bridge at Montereau, supporters of the Dauphin Charles assassinated John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, eliminating one of the most powerful figures in French politics. This act of treachery had profound consequences that extended far beyond the immediate participants, fundamentally altering the balance of power in France and creating new opportunities for English diplomacy. The assassination of John the Fearless drove his son and heir, Philip the Good, into alliance with Henry V against the Dauphin who had sanctioned his father's murder. This Burgundian alliance was perhaps the greatest diplomatic triumph of Henry's career, providing him with powerful French allies who brought not only military resources but also crucial legitimacy to his claims. With Burgundian support, Henry could present himself as the defender of lawful authority against a Dauphin who had forfeited his right to rule through regicide. The Treaty of Troyes, signed on May 21, 1420, represented the apparent culmination of Henry's ambitions and the closest he would come to achieving his dream of uniting the crowns of England and France. Under its terms, King Charles VI of France acknowledged Henry as his heir and regent, effectively disinheriting his own son the Dauphin in favour of the English king. The treaty also arranged for Henry's marriage to Catherine of Valois, Charles's daughter, cementing the dynastic alliance that would theoretically unite the two kingdoms upon the French king's death. The ceremony that saw Henry wed Catherine on June 2nd, 1420, at Troyes Cathedral was deliberately modest, reflecting the king's understanding that ostentatious display might antagonise French sensibilities. Yet beneath this surface simplicity lay profound political significance. Through his marriage to a daughter of France, Henry was establishing a bloodline that would give his descendants unquestionable legitimacy as French monarchs. The union of the Red Rose of Lancaster with the fleur-de-lis of France seemed to promise a new era of peace and unity between the traditional enemies. Catherine of Valois proved to be far more than a mere political pawn in the great game of medieval diplomacy. Intelligent, cultured, and possessed of considerable personal charm, she quickly established herself as a significant figure in her own right. Her genuine affection for Henry, combined with her deep understanding of French political culture, made her an invaluable ally in his efforts to win acceptance among his new French subjects. The birth of Prince Henry on December 6, 1421, at Windsor Castle, seemed to confirm divine blessing upon the union of England and France. The infant who would one day rule as Henry VI carried in his veins the blood of both Plantagenet and Valois, Lancastrian and Capetian. His very existence appeared to vindicate his father's claims, and to promise a future in which the ancient enmity between England and France would be resolved through dynastic unity. Yet even as Henry celebrated these diplomatic and personal triumphs, the military situation in France remained precarious and demanding. The Dauphin Charles, far from accepting his disinheritance, had established an alternative court at Bourges and continued to resist English authority throughout central and southern France. His forces, though unable to match English armies in open battle, proved adept at guerrilla warfare and the defence of fortified positions. The disaster at Bourges on March 22, 1421, served as a stark reminder that English military superiority was not absolute, and that overconfidence could lead to catastrophic defeat. Henry's brother Thomas, Duke of Clarence, led an English force into battle against Franco-Scottish forces without adequate reconnaissance or tactical preparation. The resulting defeat not only cost Thomas his life, but also demonstrated that English forces could be beaten when they abandoned the careful tactics that had brought success at Agincourt. Henry's response to the defeat at Bourges revealed the mature leadership skills he had developed over his years as king. Rather than seeking immediate revenge or allowing the setback to disrupt his larger strategic plans, he methodically assembled the forces necessary to restore English military superiority while using the interval to strengthen his diplomatic position. This measured response demonstrated the self-control and strategic thinking that distinguished great commanders from merely competent ones. The final campaign of Henry's life, launched in 1421, was intended to complete the conquest of those French territories that still resisted English authority. The Siege of Meaux, which began in October 1421, became a prolonged and gruelling affair that tested both Henry's military skills and his physical endurance. The town's strategic position and determined garrison made it a formidable obstacle that would require all the king's expertise in siege warfare to overcome. During the months-long siege of Meaux, Henry began to show signs of the illness that would ultimately claim his life. Whether it was dysentery, as many historians believe, or some other disease common to medieval military camps, the king's health began to deteriorate noticeably as the siege dragged on through the winter of 1421-22. Yet he refused to abandon his post or delegate command to subordinates, driving himself with the same relentless determination that had characterized his entire career. The fall of Meaux, on May 11th, 1422, proved to be Henry's final military victory. The town that had resisted English arms for over 6 months finally surrendered, its capture removing the last significant obstacle to English control of the approaches to Paris. Yet the triumph came at a terrible personal cost. The king who had achieved this victory was clearly a dying man, his once vigorous constitution worn down by years of campaigning and the accumulated stress of ruling 2 kingdoms. As Henry's health continued to decline throughout the summer of 1422, he turned his attention to ensuring the future of the dual monarchy he had created. The careful provisions he made for the regency government that would rule in his infant son's name demonstrated the same attention to detail that had characterized his military campaigns. He understood that his greatest achievement, the union of England and France under a single crown, would survive his death only if he could establish institutions capable of governing effectively in his absence. Queen Catherine's arrival in France during Henry's final illness provided some comfort to the dying king, allowing him to see his beloved wife one last time and to make final arrangements for their son's upbringing. The young prince, still less than a year old, represented both Henry's greatest hope and his deepest anxiety. Hope that the Lancastrian dynasty would continue to rule both kingdoms, anxiety that an infant monarch might not be able to maintain the unity that had been achieved through such enormous effort. On August 26, 1422, as his strength continued to ebb, Henry summoned his will and made final provisions for the care of his son and the governance of his realms. The document he signed that day reflected not only his practical concerns about succession and administration, but also his deep religious faith and his belief that his achievements had been blessed by divine providence. The king who had begun his reign as a questionable usurper was preparing to meet his maker as the undisputed ruler of the two greatest kingdoms in Western Europe. The end came on August 31st, 1422, at the Château de Vincennes, just outside Paris. Henry V, the warrior king who had transformed the political landscape of medieval Europe through his remarkable combination of military genius and diplomatic skill, breathed his last surrounded by his closest advisers and secure in the knowledge that he had achieved more in his brief reign than most monarchs accomplished in decades of rule. The immediate aftermath of Henry's death saw a careful orchestration of ceremonies designed to honour his memory while ensuring the smooth transition of power to his infant heir. His body was transported with great solemnity through France and then across the Channel to England, where he was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey on November the 7th, 1422. The elaborate funeral procession served not only as a final tribute to a remarkable king, but also as a demonstration of the continuity and stability of the monarchy he had established. Yet even as England mourned its greatest medieval monarch, the fragility of his achievements was becoming apparent. The death of Charles VI of France just 2 months after Henry's own demise meant that the infant Henry III inherited both kingdoms simultaneously, but the practical challenges of governing two realms through a regency council proved overwhelming. The political and military unity that Henry V had achieved through personal leadership began to unravel almost immediately after his death. The legacy of Henry V extends far beyond the military victories and territorial conquests that marked his brief but spectacular reign. His transformation of England from a divided and uncertain kingdom into a confident European power had lasting effects on English national identity and political culture. The methods he developed for financing military campaigns, organising siege warfare, and governing conquered territories influenced military and administrative practice for generations. Perhaps most importantly, Henry's achievements at Agincourt and in the subsequent conquest of France provided the English people with a shared narrative of national greatness that would inspire them through centuries of triumph and adversity. The image of the warrior king leading his outnumbered forces to victory against overwhelming odds became a powerful symbol of English courage and determination that found its ultimate expression in the works of William Shakespeare. The playwright's Henry V, written nearly 2 centuries after the king's death, transformed the historical monarch into a figure of almost mythical proportions whose St. Crispin's Day speech would inspire countless generations of English speakers. Shakespeare's band of brothers became the embodiment of national unity and shared purpose, while his portrayal of Henry as the ideal combination of warrior and king established a template for heroic leadership that continues to resonate today. Yet the real Henry V was a more complex figure than Shakespeare's idealized portrait suggests. His achievements came at enormous cost in human suffering, while his methods sometimes violated the moral standards that he publicly espoused. The massacre of prisoners at Agincourt, the harsh treatment of civilians during the siege of Rouen, and the ruthless suppression of religious dissent all revealed aspects of his character that contradicted the chivalric ideal he claimed to represent. These contradictions should not diminish our appreciation of Henry's remarkable achievements, but rather remind us that historical figures, however great, were products of their time and circumstances. The medieval world in which Henry lived was harsh and unforgiving, where kings ruled through force as much as consent, and where the survival of dynasties often depended on actions that later ages would consider morally questionable. What remains undeniable is that Henry V accomplished more in his brief reign than most monarchs achieve in much longer careers. Through a remarkable combination of military genius, diplomatic skill, and personal charisma, he transformed the political map of medieval Europe while establishing his dynasty on foundations that seemed unshakable. That these achievements proved temporary does not diminish their significance, or the extraordinary abilities of the man who accomplished them. As we reach the end of our journey through the remarkable life of Henry V, we find ourselves contemplating a legacy that extends far beyond the medieval world in which he lived and died. The warrior king who began life as a hostage in Richard II's court and ended it as the acknowledged ruler of England and France had compressed into his brief 35 years' achievements that would have been remarkable for any monarch, regardless of the length of their reign. The immediate consequences of Henry's death were profound and far-reaching, though they unfolded in ways that the dying king could hardly have anticipated. His infant son, Henry VI, inherited titles to both the English and French thrones, but the political and military unity that his father had achieved through personal leadership began to fragment almost immediately. The regency governments established to rule in the young king's name lacked both the authority and the resources necessary to maintain English control over the vast territories that Henry V had conquered. In France, the Dauphin Charles, the son whom the Treaty of Troyes had declared illegitimate, refused to accept his disinheritance and continued to resist English authority from his strongholds south of the Loire. His cause was immeasurably strengthened by the appearance of Joan of Arc, whose mystical visions and unwavering faith inspired French resistance and gradually turned the tide of war against the English occupiers. The girl who claimed divine guidance to drive the English from French soil succeeded where seasoned military commanders had failed. The gradual loss of Henry's French conquests over the decades following his death has led some historians to question whether his achievements were ultimately ephemeral and his methods fundamentally flawed. They point to the enormous cost in lives and treasure that his wars consumed, the temporary nature of English rule in France, and the civil conflicts that would eventually tear England apart during the Wars of the Roses as evidence that Henry's legacy was ultimately destructive rather than constructive. Yet such judgments may be too harsh and historically short-sighted. Henry V lived in an age when military conquest and dynastic claim were accepted as legitimate bases for royal authority, and his methods differed little from those employed by other successful medieval monarchs. More importantly, his achievements had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate question of whether England would permanently rule France, consequences that shaped the development of both kingdoms for centuries to come. The military innovations that Henry pioneered or perfected during his campaigns had lasting effects on the art of warfare. His systematic approach to siege warfare, combining traditional methods with the latest developments in gunpowder technology, became a model for subsequent military operations throughout Europe. His methods of organising and supplying large armies influenced military logistics for generations, while his tactical use of longbowmen continued to be studied by military theorists long after firearms had made archery obsolete on the battlefield. Perhaps more significantly, Henry's reign marked a crucial stage in the development of English national identity and political culture. His victories at Harfleur and Agincourt provided the English people with a shared narrative of triumph that helped to unite a kingdom that had been divided by civil war and political uncertainty. The sense of national purpose and divine favour that his successes generated became a powerful force in English political life, contributing to the development of institutions and traditions that would ultimately make England a major European power. The financial and administrative methods that Henry developed to support his military campaigns also had important long-term consequences. His innovative approaches to raising money through loans and subsidies, his systematic exploitation of commercial revenues, and his efficient administration of conquered territories all contributed to the development of more sophisticated governmental institutions. These developments would serve England well in future conflicts and contribute to the kingdom's eventual emergence as a dominant maritime and commercial power. The cultural legacy of Henry V proved to be even more enduring than his political and military achievements. Within decades of his death, chroniclers and poets were already transforming the historical king into a figure of legend, emphasizing his virtues while minimizing or ignoring his flaws. This process of mythologization reached its culmination in the works of William Shakespeare, whose dramatic portrayal of Henry V established the template for the ideal English monarch that continues to influence popular perceptions today. Shakespeare's Henry V, with his stirring speeches and noble character, became the embodiment of English martial virtue and patriotic sentiment. The playwright's famous St. Crispin's Day speech, with its references to "we few, we happy few, we band of brothers," created an image of selfless leadership and shared sacrifice that would inspire English speakers for centuries. During World War II, Laurence Olivier's film adaptation of the play became a powerful tool of wartime propaganda, demonstrating the continuing relevance of Henry's example in times of national crisis. Yet the real Henry V was both more complex and more human than the idealized figure of literature and legend. His reign was marked not only by glorious victories but also by harsh decisions that caused immense suffering to those who opposed him. His treatment of prisoners at Agincourt, his conduct during the siege of Rouen, and his suppression of religious dissent all revealed aspects of his character that contradicted the chivalric ideal he claimed to represent. These contradictions remind us that historical figures, however great their achievements, were products of their time and circumstances. The medieval world in which Henry lived was violent and unforgiving, where survival often depended on ruthless action, and where concepts of humanitarian restraint had little practical application. To judge Henry by modern standards is to misunderstand both the man and his age, while to ignore the moral complexities of his reign is to reduce him to a cardboard hero unworthy of serious historical study. What emerges from a careful examination of Henry V's life and reign is a portrait of a remarkably gifted individual who maximised his opportunities while minimising his limitations. Born into a world of political uncertainty and dynastic conflict, he developed the skills and qualities necessary not merely to survive but to excel. His military genius was matched by his diplomatic ability, his personal courage by his political acumen, his religious faith by his practical understanding of power. The transformation of Henry from an untested young king to the Conqueror of France represents one of the most remarkable personal developments in medieval history. The prince who had learned the arts of war in the hills of Wales became the monarch who dictated terms to the greatest kingdom in Europe. The youth who had quarrelled with his father over policy became the mature ruler who commanded the respect and loyalty of subjects in two different countries. This transformation was not merely a matter of natural development or favourable circumstances, but reflected Henry's extraordinary capacity for learning and growth. Each challenge he faced taught him valuable lessons that he applied to subsequent difficulties, while each success built his confidence and expanded his vision of what was possible. The king who died at Vincennes in 1422 bore little resemblance to the uncertain young man who had been crowned at Westminster 9 years earlier. The brevity of Henry's reign, just 9 years from coronation to death, makes his achievements all the more remarkable. In less than a decade, he had transformed England from a divided and uncertain kingdom into the dominant power in Western Europe. He had conquered territories that his predecessors had only dreamed of controlling, established diplomatic relationships that enhanced English prestige throughout Christendom, and created institutions that would influence governmental development for generations. That these achievements proved temporary should not diminish our appreciation of their significance or the extraordinary abilities of the man who accomplished them. The political unity of medieval Europe was always fragile and contingent, dependent on personal relationships and individual capabilities that could not easily be transferred to successors. Henry's failure to create lasting institutions capable of governing his dual monarchy reflects the limitations of medieval political technology rather than deficiencies in his own vision or abilities. The enduring fascination with Henry V among historians, writers, and the general public reflects something deeper than mere antiquarian interest or patriotic sentiment. His story embodies themes that resonate across the centuries: the transformation of potential into achievement, the triumph of determination over adversity, the complex relationship between personal ambition and public service. These universal themes help to explain why Henry's example continues to inspire and challenge readers more than 6 centuries after his death. In our modern world, where leadership is often measured by poll numbers and quarterly results rather than lasting achievements, Henry V's example offers a different model of success. His willingness to take enormous risks for the possibility of transformative victory, his ability to inspire ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things, and his capacity to learn from both success and failure provide lessons that remain relevant despite the vast changes that separate his world from ours. As we reflect on Henry's remarkable journey from the Tower of Monmouth Castle to the throne of two kingdoms, we are reminded that individual agency and personal determination can indeed shape the course of history. The boy who might have lived and died in obscurity instead became one of the most celebrated monarchs in English history, his name forever linked with courage, determination, and the pursuit of seemingly impossible dreams. The gentle rain that falls on the fields of Agincourt today waters soil that was once soaked with the blood of the greatest chivalric army in Europe, conquered by a king who understood that victory belongs not to the largest forces but to the best led. The ancient stones of Westminster Abbey shelter the tomb of a monarch whose achievements echo through the centuries, inspiring each new generation to dream boldly and act decisively in pursuit of their own vision of greatness. And so, we leave King Henry V where we found him, not as a figure of distant history, but as a living example of human potential, realised through courage, determination, and unwavering commitment to a cause greater than oneself. In the quiet moments before sleep claims us, we can perhaps hear an echo of that voice that once stirred men's hearts at Harfleur and Agincourt, reminding us that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they dare to dream and possess the courage to pursue those dreams against all odds. Sleep well, dear listener, and may your own dreams be filled with the noble ambitions and steadfast courage that marked the remarkable life of Henry V, the warrior king whose legacy transcends the mere facts of history to become a source of inspiration for all who seek to make their mark upon the world. The story ends, but the example endures, whispering across the centuries that greatness lies within reach of those bold enough to grasp it, and strong enough to hold it against all who would take it away. Let these gentle words of Henry's extraordinary journey carry you peacefully into slumber, where perhaps you too might dream of crowns and conquests, of brotherhood forged in battle, and of the eternal human quest to transform possibility into reality. Good night, sweet dreamer, and remember always that the greatest victories are won not on battlefields but in the human heart, where courage conquers fear and determination overcomes doubt. Thank you for joining us on this peaceful journey through the life of Henry V. If this tale of the warrior king has touched your heart or carried you gently towards sleep, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Sleepy Crown for more soothing historical tales. Sweet dreams, and until we meet again in the realm of peaceful slumber.